Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. Welcome to Spring Cottage outside Maidenhead in the United Kingdom. Spring Cottage belongs to Clifton, a stately home which lies up the hill around there. You can't see it for the trees. And so this is one of the little cottages in the grounds of this marvellous stately home, but I'll talk more about Clifton a little bit later. So that's the River Thames, and you see this little pleasure craft pootling by. And Clifton's got its own private jetty. Clifton's a hotel these days. I think you probably can't see it from this angle. It's just beyond camera shot over there. Anyway, why is Spring Cottage important? Well, to do the Profumo Scandal. So it was the summer of 1963, if memory serves. Might have been 62. When Jack Profumo, the Minister for War, was here. I think he's the last one to have that title of Minister for War, now Defence Secretary. So he was of distant Italian descent. His name actually means smelly in Italian. He was an old Harrovian, I think went to Cambridge, and he'd been elected to Parliament during the Second World War, while he was still in his 20s. He was a Conservative, and he was married, he had children. But then he came here for parties that were held. Now, Stephen Ward was an osteopath who was treating high society in London. He was also a gifted artist. He used to sketch various people, like Prince Philip was sent out to Israel on assignment to sketch famous people there. And he treated the Astors who owned the house, the very wealthy Astor family. David Astor, who owned the Guardian newspaper. There were this Anglo-American family who'd been prominent for well, almost a century in this country by the time of the scandal. But anyway, so this was his country boathold, Stephen Ward. He rented it. He'd studied in the United States to be an osteopath. Some people said it was a degree mill. He sometimes styled himself Dr. Ward. He was the son of a vicar as well. And then he also had a flat on Wimpole Street Mews in London, outside which I filmed about 3 years ago. Anyway, so there was a pool party late one summer's evening, and he met, I think, the 19-year-old Christine Keeler. She'd grown up in poverty in Uxbridge, just outside London, not very far away. I'm not sure if she knew who her father was. She'd had a liaison with an African-American serviceman here when she was a teenager. He went back to the United States. She gave birth to her child. Now, unwed pregnancy was considered disgraceful those days. A romantic liaison with a black man was considered shameful as well. There was an awful lot of racialism at the time. She gave birth to her child. Her infant died in days, and she drifted into London. She worked in various seedy jobs, and then she was a nightclub hostess, a striptease artist, and so forth. A friend of Mandy Rice Davies, a Welsh girl who's slightly younger than her. But anyway, so here, the 19-year-old Christine Keeler met this middle-aged Tory politician, and they began an adulterous relationship. This is going on for some time. Now, Miss Keeler was generous with her affections, to say the least. So this was swinging London happening. She also had an intimate relationship with Colonel Yevgeny Ivanov, who was the Soviet naval attaché, as in a uniformed spy. And so, I can't remember the surname, was it Whig Prosser, something like that? This Labour MP, a former army officer, represented Brixton on one of those London constituencies, and he found out about this. He was asking questions in the House of Commons. What's his nature of the Minister for War's relationship with Miss Christine Keeler? Has there been any impropriety? You do realise it's noise that she is climbing into bed with a Soviet naval attaché and so forth. So Jack Profumo stood up and he said there was no impropriety between himself and Miss Keeler. She's also met his wife. Now, the first bit is a lie. The second bit I'm not sure about. And that was it. It was quite a fulsome defence. It was a categorical denial that he'd committed adultery. I mean, he didn't specifically say that, but no impropriety would mean, yes, he hadn't had any physical liaison with her. But anyway, that was a lie. I'm not quite sure how they were to prove that it was a lie. So then he resigned in disgrace because lying in Parliament is considered opprobrious. So that was the end of his career there. And then he was deeply ashamed of himself, partly because he was a zealous Christian and he thought he'd committed a terrible sin. So because of his iniquity, he had to go away. He was a charity worker in the East End of London. I think he was later re-elected to a county council or a borough council, but that's as far as he got in politics. About 20-something years later, Margaret Thatcher saying, no, he must be invited to Downing Street. He must be forgiven after all these years of penance. Surely he's expiated his sins. Colonel Ivanov went back to the Soviet Union and was really never heard from again. I don't think he was killed or anything like that, but he'd been getting up to no good when he was here. He wasn't a spy for NATO or anything, but he'd been blackmailable because he'd had this extramarital affair. He was also married. So Christine Keeler, she really wallowed in her notoriety, and she was on that famous photo shoot when she was nude, supposedly covering up with a chair. She later said she was wearing a thong at the time. So, and she sort of soon faded from the public eye. There's a film that came out about 1990 entitled Scandal. Her friend Mandy Rice Davies, she moved to Israel, married a wealthy man there, still there. Has got, is it a nightclub or a restaurant called Mandy, something like that. Christine Keeler, she later on in about 2000 said, oh, it was all part of an espionage ring. People said it's a ridiculous fantasy. No, it wasn't. That she thought she was some sort of super spy. And she also had an intimate relationship with Johnny Edgecombe, a Trinidadian gangster who was here, who I think the whole thing came to the press because he'd fired shots at her door and he'd been arrested, charged with discharging a firearm with intent to endanger life, given several years in prison. He was later released. He was then deported back to Trinidad, where, if I'm right, he was actually later hanged for murder. So she lived in the UK. She had at least one son. I don't think she got married again, but really after a few years, people had just lost interest in her. But periodically, she was mentioned in the press. But that's where it all began. So that's why I think it's Philip Larkin wrote, sexual intercourse began in 1963, before the Beatles' first LP. You would know what an LP is if you're of my generation or younger, as in long play record. They have to be these huge black circular things, a record, to play on a record player. So that was the Profumo Scandal. I remember years later, when I was a schoolboy, my last year at school, there was a King Scholar there, and he was Profumo KS. And I thought, well, there's only one of the Profumo I've ever heard of by that name. And I said, Profumo, are you Jack Profumo's grandson? And rather shamefacedly, he confessed that he was. He probably thought there was something faintly embarrassing about being recognised being descended from that man. And after Jack Profumo died, his son published a memoir entitled Bringing the House Down. So there's a double entendre, as in bringing the House of Commons down, but also getting lots of laughs about how his father had tried to hide the scandal from him when Profumo's son was a little boy, didn't want him to know anything about this. It was considered so deeply shameful. Well, that's enough from me, so please subscribe to my YouTube channel and book online lessons with me in history, politics, religious studies, citizenship, French and law. And moreover, I urgently need donations to sustain the channel, so kindly donate most liberally to my channel on PayPal. You'll find me there as georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Callahan spelled Callaghan. So Callahan, that's all small letters. Okay, so toodle pip from the banks of the River Thames. Bye.